Good evening. It's good to be here with you tonight at MCC Boston. I'm thankful to Reverend Melissa for having me here and in this pulpit, for Jim Metulsky and for Mark and Paul and Nancy for orienting me to worship here. It's been my privilege to worship here with you several times over the last 2 years that I've been here in Boston. As Jim mentioned, I'm the pastor of Old Cambridge Baptist Church, your siblings in faith just across the river in Harvard Square. And I don't know why so many people are afraid of Baptists. So we're a good group of people, some of us. And I think OCBC really is your kind of Baptists. OCBC was the first Baptist congregation in the country to become officially welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ people in 1983, the year I was born. And since 1983, OCBC has been led by exclusively lesbian and gay pastors for the last 34 years. OCBC is a church that has, like MCC, defied the expectations and restricting dictates of the status quo in providing sanctuary for a Salvadorian labor unionist in 1984, being infiltrated by the FBI, and around that same time becoming welcoming and affirming of LGBT people after the election of the current administration and the promises that were rapidly being fulfilled regarding our undocumented siblings. OCBC felt the call to re-enter sanctuary practice, and we now have a coalition of, I believe at last count, it was 11 churches and a Harvard student group that are in a coalition of sanctuary practice together, providing sanctuary to a young mother and her 2 children who are at risk of deportation, living in one of our churches in Harvard Square. So yeah, I think we're your kind of Baptists. And since you worship on Sunday evening, if you ever want something to do on Sunday morning, you're always welcome at OCBC in Harvard Square. We'd love to see you. I am the kind of Baptist preacher who preaches from a full manuscript every single Sunday, which is also not typically Baptist. But tonight, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go Metulsky style with just a few notes, although I didn't stick them in my Bible. It's burgeoning with Post-its. I just have a little outline here, because this is sort of a sermon and sort of an introduction to a book that I wrote for a particular purpose that is, I think, aligned with your own mission here at MCC. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I wrote the book, A Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQIA Youth, because I was a queer youth in a Southern Baptist church in South Carolina, growing up with no one who had a book like this. And I grew up in a place in South Carolina where I literally knew not one LGBTQ person my entire childhood, my entire adolescence, and even partway into my college years in North Carolina. No one in my community was out. I certainly never knew another LGBTQ minister anywhere around my region. But I grew up as a child of 5 or so, 4 or 5, loving church, and particularly loving church music. I perhaps couldn't be any gayer that I grew up wanting to be a church organist. When kindergartners would share what they wanted to do when they grew up, I always said I wanted to be a church organist. And so when I was 5 years old, I started begging my father and my grandfather, who were both contractors, to build me a church in my backyard. And after a year of begging, they built me a church in my backyard. It was only big enough for about 8 folks, and I had my neighbor friends come and play church with me, and my other grandfather would come and play church with me in the afternoons. My grandmother sewed me a little robe and ministerial stole that I would wear as a little 6-year-old child. A woman in the neighboring town saw the front page news story about this church and called my parents and said she had an old organ in her basement that she wanted to get rid of, and would we like it? And so we got an organ, and we put this little organ in the chapel. We got a stained glass window out of my actual church's basement and put it in there. My grandfather built a white steeple for the church. And so I was playing church as a 6-year-old child, also simultaneously at that point becoming aware of my own same-sex attraction, and having no language to put to that, having no experience that I had seen either in real life or in the media, to resonate with. And grew up through middle school, through high school, intuitively knowing that if I came out, it would be bad for me. Even though I rarely heard really overt negative messages about LGBTQ people, which made me pretty lucky. But I heard nothing about LGBT people. As far as I knew, aside from my own experience, they didn't exist. So into high school and early years of college, I began to reconcile my own faith and my own sexuality in a way that I still wasn't sort of ready to be out to anyone, but I was committed because of my sense of call to gospel rooted in peace to become an activist on my campus for the inclusivity of LGBTQ people. So I began doing that work on my little Baptist college campus in North Carolina, and met a guy there who eventually came out to me long before I came out to him. And the year after I graduated from college and was going to seminary, he and I began to shift our 2-year friendship into something more than friendship. And we went on our first gay date at the Religious Art Museum at Bob Jones University. What? Where do you go on dates? That's a good place, I'm telling you. Bob Jones University, our first gay date. Then we went to seminary together. Then we served a Southern Baptist church together, where we had to be completely, closeted about our relationship, about our sexuality. But then began to come out to our seminary community once we found a church that was an affirming Baptist church in Decatur, Georgia. So that's kind of why I wrote the book. When I was a youth minister in North Carolina, also in a Southern Baptist church, also completely closeted there, I worked with a youth who was a really terrific young man who was a kind of stalwart member of this youth group. 2 or 3 years after I'd left this church and gone to seminary, I had heard that he had come out to his mother. He'd never been out when I was there, and I didn't have a relationship with him really to speak up anymore. This was 3 or 4 years after I'd left this church. His senior year of high school, I believe last semester of his senior year of high school, came out to his mother, and his mother kicked him out of the house. He lived with friends for a while. You've heard this story before, probably 100 times. He lived with friends for a while. Then when that hospitality ran out, he had to move to another state to live with family members, had to drop out of high school. He was a really stellar student. Had to drop out of high school last semester of his senior year, and took him years to finish his high school diploma and then get into college. And no one in that church, did anything, which really troubled me, because that church was not unique. It was a very good, loving, nice church, but no one did anything to intervene in this kid's life. And so I was telling Melissa before the service that I didn't really write this book, A Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQIA Youth, because I thought, well, I just need to write a beautiful book about ministry with queer youth. I wrote this book because the book needed to exist. It needed to exist for people like me growing up in churches in the South where there were good-hearted people who just didn't really know anything about LGBTQ folks. People like this youth for whom no one came to his aid when he needed it most. I wrote it for ministers in churches that are progressive, justice-oriented, LGBTQ-affirming churches who have made a public statement of affirmation, but who have no necessary kind of skills to enact that affirmation in a way that can be truly life-saving and life-giving for LGBTQIA youth. So it gives an introduction to gender identity and expression, to sexual and affectional orientation, in a way that, of course, treats identities of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, but that also gives really clear attention to the ways that our embodiment of gender identity and expression and our embodiment of sexuality is not restricted to the gay-straight binary or the male-female binary, but is fluid rather than static, that is non-binary, and then it deals with kind of the typical crises that many LGBTQ youth face in their lives. Homelessness, family rejection, It deals with working with families of LGBTQIA youth. When I went to do my PhD at Brite Divinity School, I studied suicide among LGBTQIA youth and the ways that religious and spiritual narratives come to constitute a sense of self leading up to suicide. And that is a kind of another book project that I'm working on now, but there's a really clear piece of this book that is about intervening in situations where suicide is a thinkable option for LGBTQIA youth. So I wrote it to be helpful to queer kids like me, to queer kids like my former youth at this church in North Carolina, and to ministers who want to be truly useful to folks in coming to fully live their faith and their sexuality and their gender identity in a congruent way. But this is also All Saints Day. And so I was trying to figure out what in the world, this book and my impetus to write it had to do with All Saints Sunday. And I started to think about, how I might describe a saint. Because as a Baptist, we don't have the kind of panoply of saints that our Catholic siblings have, or a process of, canonizing someone as a saint. But we have saints, for sure. And I begin to think about the people that I think about as saints. And I think, I'm going to try out this definition on you and see what you think about it. I think a saint is someone who sees the impossible situations that are dictated by the status quo and then proceeds to enact the impossible possibilities that exist in those situations. Saints are people who don't take the restrictive dictates of the status quo as fixed, but work to transcend those seeming impossibilities. And this text of Scripture, I think, is really indicative of that. From 1 John, see what love the Father, Mother has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know Christ. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. Do you hear the possibilities in that text? We are rooted in our identities as children of God, beloved of God, wrapped in the love of the cosmic Christ. We are firmly rooted in that identity. But what we will be has not yet been revealed. And I thought about a story that I think would be particularly appropriate to tell here at MCC. And most likely you all know this story, being in this historic LGBTQ church. But it's the story of the very first gathering of LGBTQ Christians for the purpose of a church space. Do you know this story? It started when a group of, a small group, half a dozen members of a Catholic parish approached the altar rail week after week for the elements of communion. And their priest, who had heard their private confessions about their sexuality, week after week refused to serve them the elements. And they stood at the altar rail of their parish where they had belonged for all their lives, and their priest passed them by and served the next person. But week after week, they approached the altar rail for the communion elements. Well, eventually, they realized that they needed a church where they could celebrate their faith and take the elements of communion that were being denied them at their current parish. So they rented space in a hotel lounge just down the street from their church. They pulled cocktail tables together to make a makeshift altar, and they founded what became known as the Eucharistic Catholic Church, named for the very thing that was denied them at their parish. Now, do you have any guesses about where this took place? If you know where it took place, don't say it yet. Well, if you don't know, where would you guess this took place? Usually when I ask people, they say San Francisco, LA, New York. This took place in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the American South. Do you have any idea what year this took place? A lot of people guess sometime around Stonewall, like the late 60s when MCC emerged, or something around that era. This took place in 1946. 1946, Atlanta, Georgia. And what's even more remarkable is the Eucharistic Catholic Church, led by Reverend George Hyde, was founded as a church that included both gay and straight people, and Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, and racially integrated in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia. Saints, seeing the restrictive dictates of the status quo that were racist and transphobic and heterosexist, and defying those dictates and doing what seemed absolutely impossible. If you had asked anyone in 1946 Atlanta, Georgia, if it was possible to found a church for LGBTQ people that included Protestants and Catholics and that was racially integrated, who would have said that's possible? But they did it. I don't know about the impossible situations that you're dealing with in particular, but I think it is pretty evident what impossible situations we are dealing with collectively. No one of them larger than the issue of our fellow sojourners here in the U.S., all over the place, being killed every day by guns. 25 or 27, I think is the last count I heard about today's shooting in Texas, is a tragedy and a travesty. 500 in Las Vegas is absolutely absurd. But in reality, 500 is just like a week's worth of gun violence victims in the U.S. that die of gun violence. 93 people a day are killed by guns in the U.S. Seems like an impossible situation at this point. And with the love of money being the root of all of our politicians' evil, it is damn near impossible to do anything about it. But, saints, doing what is seemingly impossible is your task, is what we're called to do, to follow the gospel of peace rooted in justice, to see what is impossible and then to undertake it. Not knowing, as Jim said about these early LGBTQ activists, not knowing if they will ever see anything come of their efforts, but knowing what their call is. And though it seems impossible, doing it. And surely that's what you're about here as a church, too. And it's good to remind yourselves about this as you move into your season of pledging. At OCBC, we're moving into our season of pledging, too. And every week, someone stands before the congregation and talks about why they belong to OCBC and what it was about OCBC that drew them in and kept them there, and how OCBC helps them live out their faith in a way that they are following a call that seems impossible, but they are doing it within this community. And you've got stories like that, too. No one asked me to come here tonight and talk about giving, but when you mentioned it, I thought, this is the very thing you're about as a congregation. So, saints, listen to this text again, because this is the call of All Saints Sunday. Beloved, we are God's children now, no matter what anybody says about us. What we will be has not yet been revealed. Can you even imagine what is possible?